right. According to my clock, it just rolled to 2 o'clock, and we always try to be sensitive to your time and getting started on time and ending on time. So, again, my name is Steve Marzoff. I'm the ISP Director here at VITA, and we're pleased to welcome you to another of our Webinar Wednesday series. Today, we have a special guest presenter. Jennifer Ellsworth is from Worldview Solutions. She serves as a GIS technical lead and project manager at Worldview, providing clients with accurate raster vector data products and network solutions with a specialization in web mapping and imagery analysis. She has her GISP and is also a certified Esri desktop professional. Jennifer played a lead role in the development of the Virginia statewide land cover data set, which is what she's here to talk about today, as many of you probably have heard or know through the Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ. VITA was provided funding to go out and capture statewide land cover data using our imagery. And that project has been completed. The data set is available. I believe it's on our clearinghouse. But what we wanted to do was have a presentation, and we asked Jennifer to kind of go through what it is and how it might be of value to localities and what some of the use cases might be. So again, please remember to mute your phone if you're not speaking, so we don't get the background noise. If you have a question, please ask. You can also use the chat feature to send it to Melissa Parsons, who can then insert the question for you. But otherwise, if we don't have any questions to start, Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And thanks for the introduction. We're glad to have you all here. I see there's a lot of folks on the call. And hopefully some of the fuzziness will let up once everyone's kind of called in and joined. So as Steve mentioned, Worldview played a large part in the data development for the Virginia Geographic Information Network's land cover product. So I'm here to speak on our behalf, but I'm also here to talk more about how local governments can use the land cover data set. I'm going to go over briefly kind of some general land use cases, but for those of you that are on the call, we are trying to focus more on how all of the localities can use this data set. So for the agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background development, a little product comparison to some other land cover data that's out there, and then I'll talk about some of the current land cover users in Virginia, and then we'll move on to the local government use cases and some accompanying case studies. And then finally, we'll talk about the download details, and the data is available on the GIS clearinghouse, so I'll have the link for that. And then if you guys have any questions at the end, but as Steve said, if you have a question while I'm talking, go ahead and pop in, that's fine as well. So the Virginia statewide land cover data set, there were a lot of players involved, and I tried to make sure I included everyone here. You have the Virginia Information Technology Agency, which is heading the product, and as Steve mentioned, the Department of Environmental Quality has been involved with the funding as well as being involved with the final classifications, the methodology for the product. We've also been working with the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and we've also been working with the EPA and folks from the Chesapeake Bay program to ensure that we're also meeting some of their requirements for the data that they needed as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then Worldview Solutions worked on the Virginia product, and Sanborn acted as a accuracy measure, and they produced all of the matrices for our overall accuracy percentages on each of our classifications. So you can see we finally decided on 12 classifications, and this is unique to the Virginia data set, but we are hoping that as every news cycle for the whole state is flown with the Virginia Ortho Photography Program, that with the right funding, we could repeat this process, stick to the same classifications, and be able to have change detection moving forward. But also with our 12 classifications, there's a lot of ability to subclassify, for users to add additional layers of complexity and modify the data sets. And it's just, there's a lot you can do with it through GIS. The targeted accuracy was 85 to 95%. So we've met at least 85% accuracy on all of our classes, with many as high as 94 or 96% accurate. So our technical plan is also available for download with the product on the clearinghouse, and that gives a breakdown of all of the accuracies per each layer as well. And this is a 1 meter product, and it's available for vector and raster download. So the vector data you can use with Esri and GIS, and then the raster product you can use independent. They're available as TIFF files. So here's just a little glimpse at what the data looks like. This is the full Virginia data set, and I pulled out a little snippet from the Eastern Shore so you can see that we are distinguishing between turf versus agricultural. You can see we've also included wetlands distinguished from water. And I don't know if you can tell exactly from the picture, but there's light green and dark green where we have distinguished tree from forest. So you'll see all of that data in the data set. So the Dataset Development, as I mentioned previously about the Chesapeake Bay program, there was really two efforts that kind of went hand in hand. The Chesapeake Bay is updating their watershed model into their phase 6, and they needed land cover for all of the Chesapeake Bay. So Virginia was going to be included in that effort as well. And then as Steve mentioned, there's the Virginia Orthophotography Program with the Virginia Base Mapping Program being flown, and DEQ supported funding for that for stormwater management planning. So both of these efforts focused a lot around stormwater management, but there's also additional use cases as well. So the product that you'll be downloading now, it's a combined years 2013 through 2015. The way that the VBMP imagery has been flown, half of the state is 2013 and about half 2015. So I know with the new VBMP moving forward, I think they're breaking the state into thirds. But before that, it was half and half every 2 years. And with the Virginia product being a 1 meter resolution, just a huge impact compared to existing models that are using the National Land Cover data set, because the NLCD is a 30 meter product. And while that works really well for national analyses, for localities to be able to get a high resolution data set that they can do fine scale mapping on, a 1 meter product is going to allow you to see a lot more detail in the map. So I've included a few screenshots here. I just kind of pulled a random place out of this state that had an example where you saw some urban, some forest, some agriculture. This is the NLCD Overlay. And currently the most up-to-date data from the NLCD is from 2011. So any current models out there are using 2011 data in Virginia. And then there is an overlay of the Virginia land cover data set. So you can see immediately from the image that the 1 meter resolution is allowing you now to pick up houses and sheds and individual roads. A lot of these get missed in the land cover data set. And also the area where you see the road is in the light pink and dark pink. And those actually were not categorized as impervious in the NLCD. They were categorized as some kind of mixed cropland. So a lot of times when you have low width features that are intersecting, they're going to be misclassified as well. But again, for large scale mapping, that's not a big deal. But for localities to be able to use the data, this has been a big improvement. Okay, so beyond the test peak day watershed updates that we're using the data for, there's also a lot of state and regional models that are running currently with the NLCD dataset that I was speaking of. And I'm just going to name a few of these. Of course, there's a lot more, but I just wanted to kind of pick out a few because the data that comes out of these models can also be used by localities. So this is kind of a different way to look at it. Without doing your own analyses, there are products out there that you can use. So the first one we mentioned here was the Virginia Development Vulnerability Model. And this is utilized by the National Heritage Program. And this is just one of many models that are part of Conservation Vision. And another one of those models is DCR's Virginia Natural Landscape Assessment, or VANLA. And that one's used for core area identification. So these models look at where there's about 100 acres of interior cover or more, and they use that to prioritize core areas for natural habitat protection. And then as far as on the regional side, you have the Richmond Regional PDC. They've done a green infrastructure project, and they're doing a land cover update, so they'll also be using the new Virginia product. And they've been reporting on percent impervious surface area estimates, and that's for long-reach transportation planning. So they'll continue to update their data as well. And then the Roanoke Valley Allegheny Regional Commission and the New River Valley Regional Commission have both been working on change detection analyses. So they're tracking land development for natural disaster management, among other things, and they're also using land cover. And then the last one I mentioned here is the Hampton Roads PDC. They've done a conservation corridor study. That's for supporting habitat protection, stormwater runoff, and total maximum daily load modeling for water supply planning. So I'll talk a little bit more about TMDLs in our use case moving forward. So I just wanted to highlight some of these and know that, their results be used for a variety of conservation and land management efforts moving forward. And we have spoken with all of these folks, and they're interested in the Virginia Land Cover product. They plan to use it moving forward. And with the data download that you'll find at the end of the slideshow, there's also a land use case white paper. And in the white paper, we highlight each of these projects going on, and it goes into a lot more detail about how they're using them. Okay. So while there's a lot of use cases beyond what I've covered here, and there's many more yet to be discovered, we've focused on 4 main areas where localities have found the most benefit out of the high-resolution land cover. And I've talked about a few Virginia localities moving forward, and then I'll talk about some localities that are not in Virginia, just to show you guys kind of a mix of what different people are doing with land cover. So the first here is about impervious surface estimates. I wanted to mention that they're an indicator of urban disturbance and population growth. So you can see where you are and then also predict where you'll be in so many years by using the percent ISA and kind of overlaying it and seeing where your development is going to happen and try to predict those percentages moving forward. And then also meeting EPA reporting requirements. So there's many guidelines out there, and you want to ensure that you're providing the most accurate numbers so that down the road you're not having to put extra time and effort toward, lengthy restoration efforts if in fact you were over-reporting, which is something that can already be happening if you're using the NLCD data set. And then stormwater management. There's a plethora of use cases there. I've just focused on a few. For better managing the effects of stormwater runoff, You can think about planning efforts that you're already using. The land cover data set is great for getting a better idea of, agricultural lands where nutrient runoff is happening, or where there's, urban extensive areas that are running off near streams. So you can look at riparian corridors. And then also support the development of a complete stormwater model, where you're looking at rainwater infiltration and runoff rates. So the land cover can help you better understand non-point sources instead of just looking at point source data. You can get a better idea of not only the volume of water that's happening during runoff, but also the intensity. And then for urban planning, monitoring and modeling urban sprawl. So you can relate the data back to public service costs, traffic congestion, loss of open space. This will give you a much better picture of what your current situation is. And also for implementing existing urban planning models, such as any urban energy and water, long-range transportation plans. If any of you are currently using that, the Virginia Land Cover product will give you more accurate data and more up-to-date data, because as I spoke, the NLCD was from 2011. And then the last one we focus on here is conservation planning. So assisting in greenway planning for habitat conservation and recreation. You can identify losses as well as isolation of habitat patches, which is also really important to recognize. If you've developed and cut off clean an area, you no longer have that connection for biodiversity. Also identifying, monitoring, and assessing resource protection areas. So RPAs can be restored or expanded, and it's important in reducing the speed of runoff. So, not just volume or intensity, but also the speed. You can also look at RPA management for improved sediment deposition and also reduction of nutrient loads that are actually reaching the stream, because the bacteria and plants within those corridors suck up some of those nutrients. And then lastly here, enabling geographically targeted approach to nutrient management and determining downstream loading rates and identifying critical source areas. So these are all just some general ideas on how you can use land cover. And then I'm going to kind of focus on each one of these individually and give you guys a use case where there are localities that are using land cover data to solve these issues. So the first one we have here focuses on impervious surfaces. So one thing you can do with the data is use it to identify the amount of impervious surface cover within a watershed. That's also referred to as percent ISA. So impervious surface cover is a strong emerging indicator of stream channel stability and stream health due to the impacts of urbanization. And there's kind of a widely recognized percentage that's used for stormwater management, where if a watershed is less than 10% impervious, then it's sensitive. If it's 10 to 25%, it's impacted. And then if it's greater than 25%, it's degraded. So you can get your county tabular data that tells you how much acreage you have overall of imperviousness. But you can take this data and then you can break it down into different watersheds, different stream corridors, and then look at just the impervious data within those. And then you can really figure out, okay, what percent impervious is here. And then you can look at future build-out plans, and then you can consider adding that acreage to the existing acreage and figure out, am I now impacting or degrading the stream? So you can project future cover potential and gain a clear understanding of the impacts of urbanization on aquatic resources. So the example I have here is from Oregon. The use cases I included from Virginia were all folks we had a chance to talk to and include into our white paper. But we did not have anyone in particular that we reached out to in Virginia that was running impervious estimates for planning. We had a lot of PDCs that were using percent ISA, but not necessarily just on a county or city level. So with further research, we found Clackamas County in Oregon, and they've been working on a surface water master planning effort. And this kind of came about from a strong desire of the public for livable communities. So, once enough people were lobbying that they were interested in this effort, then that combined with all of the strict EPA regulations that have to be followed involving percent ISA and total nutrient loads gave the incentive to maintain the health and to continue with these planning efforts. So what they did is they created some maps and they provided some development alternatives to see kind of where their percent impervious surface ended up. So from the image on the left, you can see these little corridor areas that they've marked out in red and labeled them in yellow. So there's some areas that are residential A or employment B. So they went through all of their existing developments and they tried to break them out into some categorization types of development. And once they were able to get into the GIS and put those into polygon format and go, okay, here's some existing areas we want to look at, they overlaid that with their impervious data and they were able to break it down to the percent impervious within each of these developments. So on the last slide, I talked about looking at percent ISA on a stream or watershed level. But these folks actually took it all the way down to individual development areas. So they did recognize through their study that they found, they tried to do a bunch of each. So when they grabbed all of their residential areas and they figured out overall size versus percent impervious, there was a little bit of a range there. So they just calced the average. So they figured out average imperviousness per what kind of acreage you would see in each of these types of developments. So once they had all of that data, they were able to start looking at development alternatives for their area, creating new features where these were planned developments, and then they were able to use the predicted percent ISA and then take all of those amounts and go, okay, are we now impacting or degrading these streams? So they took the percent ISA to a very localized level, but then they combined it and added it all together to look back at the watershed level and see if they were impacting their stream. And if they were able to modify their development efforts, try to find new areas for development, and they were able to use the land cover data for that as well, because the land cover data provided them with forested lands and open lands that they could use for future development ideas. So they also used other natural resource protection GIS layers that the county had, and then kind of combined that all with their buildable land. And they also took into consideration riparian corridors, also slope restrictions. So those were other GIS layers that you wouldn't necessarily get directly from the land cover product, but all of the data combined. And then, they used the weighted percentages and then summed them to get the overall impervious. So I thought that was a great study on a local level where you could focus on the impervious data coming from the land cover product. Okay, Stormwater management. So another idea here is that you can use the land cover data to identify MS4 or municipal separate storm sewer system regulated areas. And you would do this as part of your total maximum daily load action plan. So under the Federal Clean Water Act, there are general permits through the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System that says you have to reduce so much pollutants of concern from small municipal separate storm sewer systems. So most localities are already looking at this data. They're trying to get their TMDL action plans together and figure out their daily loads. Well, the pollution of concern loads are simply a function of the amount of regulated pervious and impervious areas and loading rates specified in the permit. So the permits are going to give you the loading rates, but you have to give them, these are the areas that are being regulated. These are my MS4 areas that are going to be calculated on. So these regulated areas are based on census urbanized areas. So that data comes from the census. But then as an individual, you're able to exclude forested lands, agricultural lands, wetlands, and open waters. So if you've already been doing this with the National Land Cover Data Set or the 2005 Department of Forestry data set or something of that nature, you could get much more accurate numbers and probably improve the amount of excluded areas by using the Virginia Land Cover Data Set. So new sources based on land development also have to be taken into account when you're doing your TMDL action plans. So you will have to look at those. And then they're derived from an analysis of approved land activities and a comparison of current planimetric data. So we've taken everyone's current planimetric data and used that in the Virginia Land Cover Data Set. So whatever was the most up-to-date data we were able to get from each locality, we used that in the product. So the example we have here is for Albemarle County. This is part of their TMDL action plan. They took the land cover data sets available and derived forest and open water and then used some additional land classes to identify the regulated areas. So you can see from the table that they were able to take their county properties, their inclusion areas, but then take roads, forests, and water and add all of their acres of exclusion. And then I also added some information as far as funding to be able to do this. The county dedicates a 0.007% annual tax on real estate value, and that goes towards the county's water resources program. And additionally, they were awarded a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Chesapeake Bay Innovative Nutrient and Sediment Reduction Grant. And that was to retrofit their dry retention basins located on private properties. So there is grant money out there and funding to help with these as well. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is urban planning and specifically monitoring the urban heat island effect. So this is another major aspect of urbanization that doesn't necessarily get looked at as often. This is where the displacement of trees and other natural vegetation happens through construction materials and increases the amount of heat energy absorbed from the sun and stored in these materials like concrete and asphalt and roofing shingles. And it really creates a quadrupled effect. With all of these darker and paved materials get more solar absorption, but then due to the lack of plants, you get less evaporative cooling. And then added to that, with the height of urbanization and tall buildings and things like that, You also get impeded reflected energy. So for any energy that would have been reflected, it may be bouncing back off of the buildings and eventually getting absorbed again. And then the last of the four is that the urban activity going on in these areas is going to create more waste heat. So a lot of studies have occurred where they've started monitoring the actual temperatures and been able to directly relate some extreme climate change type activity and heat waves going on around where they've had urban development. And there's also health risks associated. So many studies have also focused on the health of individuals. But there's also risk to property and the critical urban infrastructure. So urban transportation infrastructure like roads and railroads are stressed with rising temperatures, and that alone can cause potholes and ruts and warping, which has been seen. And then extreme heat also causes metal power lines to expand. So that impedes the efficiency with which transducers can shed heat, lowering the efficiency of electricity systems and water systems. And then also, anytime temperatures exceed 86 degrees, studies show that there's significant increases in water demand. So you're going to kind of get that counter effect as well. So this case study was in Louisville, Kentucky. They did a rather extensive urban heat management study, and I haven't really outlined everything they did here, but I have a reference at the end of the slideshow where you can read the whole report. And they actually looked at health risks, and they monitored areas over, I think, 10 years or so. They were able to get a lot of correlating information. So with their urban heat management study, this is part of a component of a broader effort to enhance livability and health and sustainability in the Louisville metro region. So some of their strategies included engineering roofing and paving materials that reflect solar radiation, like green roofs, and then enhancement of the surface area of trees and grass and other plant material. So they were also looking at replacing parking lots and replanting if the parking lots weren't really being used. And then also a reduction in waste heat emissions through energy efficient programs. So they really looked at each of these individually, and then they also did a combined study. And, as expected, they found by combining multiple things that they were able to make a big impact in the urban heat island effect. So the images you see here on the left, they actually took the metro region and divided it into a small grid. And they were able to take surface temperatures across the whole area by mapping them through thermal satellite images. So they took thermal images and were able to then get the actual temperatures happening in each of these little grids. So originally, I think they said there were only 2 areas in the city where weather was being mapped, but then they were able to get thousands of thermal readings. And then they also, once they had that, they performed climate model simulations. So on the right image, you can see where they've taken into account other GIS data to then classify each of these grids and give it, the thermal grid values. So this consisted of 4 steps. First, they took an inventory of their land surface materials. So that was the part where they incorporated land cover data, and they were able to kind of figure out where they had impervious, where they had pervious, where they had barren lands, and, a few other water, things like that. So all of that they could have derived from the Virginia Land Cover Product, and that you all could get from that. And then they modeled the temperature under current conditions, and then modeled the temperature in response to different heat management strategies. So as I mentioned, this was over a lengthy period of time, I think about 10 years, but they started implementing each of these strategies like green roofs and replanting efforts, converting barren land to pasture land, and then they continued to monitor the temperatures and look at health benefits as well. So through this study, they were able to come up with a lot of recommendations, and they were able to see where, they were making the biggest impact. So that's a great study to reference that uses the urban heat island effect. And then in the same study, they also showcased some efforts by other cities to mitigate the urban heat island effect. So they mentioned that in Chicago, Illinois, they planted over 500,000 trees to offset rising temperatures and to increase the moisture retention to minimize flooding. So they've done similar studies and found the benefits. Also in Los Angeles, they adopted a 2014 cool roofing ordinance. So a lot of these studies talk about how they've also started to add new zoning ordinances and different laws that will, kind of force people to start complying to decrease this effect as well. And then Seattle, Washington, and Washington, D.C. have also had new zoning policies established for minimum green area goals for all new development. So definitely the urban heat island effect is getting more attention now, but that's something you can consider. And the last thing we're focusing on today is conservation planning. So specifically here, we're going to talk about the blue-green infrastructure designs. Typically, you'll just hear green infrastructure, but if you really want to look at aquatic systems as well, if you're an area that has a lot of water, you're going to want to do a blue-green infrastructure design. So when you're talking about blue-green infrastructure, you're really looking at what connects urban hydrological functions with urban nature and landscaping design and planning. So there's a lot of good effects when you take these kind of planning initiatives into effect. You can protect against flooding and damages from climate change. Also identifying connected natural systems and ecological processes that provide critical functions like soils for farming or habitat for wildlife, drinking water for storage and infiltration, and clean air. And then there's socioeconomic benefits as well in terms of enhanced livability, as well as, complementing, in some cases, replacing the need for gray infrastructure. So gray infrastructure is like stormwater drains and hardscape flood walls, pumping stations, all of that. And then additionally, green infrastructure planning supports tourism and recreation, and especially fisheries if you consider the blue infrastructure. And the next use case talks about the timely opportunity for promoting this kind of infrastructure is when you've already planned for some kind of renewal of infrastructure in your, planning processes. So if you know that you're going to be doing some new designs, it's a great time to start considering these things. So the example we use today is from Accomack County. They did a blue-green infrastructure study where they developed some asset maps to inform their current county activities and initiatives and the county's existing comprehensive plan. And they actually also used data that came from the Virginia National Landscape Assessment that we spoke about earlier on the state level. They took that data for Accomack County and used it as part of this study. So with these asset maps, the kind of assets they're looking at are critical forests, watersheds, wetlands, working lands such as fisheries and agriculture, areas for recreation and conservation. So the forests and the wetlands and all of that data they're able to derive from land cover. So that's another opportunity to use the new land cover product. And then managing these enhancing assets helps ensure that the county maintained its distinct character. So Accomack County had a lot of tourism and history, and that's why they really, focused on this, especially with, fishing and all of their blue infrastructure. So they use this planning effort to identify areas where landowners and developers work with the county and conserve land using tools such as easements, clustering, and proffering land as part of rezoning requests. They also completed a risk assessment and determined which lands were at risk from development. So that was another piece to the study at the end. And this was also funded in part by a grant from the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program at DEQ. So if you're a locality that has a lot of water, that's something that you could look into as well. And what they found was that there were many corridors that were not of sufficient width, and that fragmentation of the landscape was one of the most significant threats to the county's assets. So they were already able to find out a lot, and this was, before they had a 1 meter resolution land cover data set. So they could definitely get some improved data accuracy with that. So that's really what we've kind of highlighted here for use cases. I have a picture here in the middle. That's the Virginia land cover data set at the 1 meter resolution. And just kind of some highlights about what we've talked about with stream corridors and stormwater management and urban sprawl and nutrient runoff. So let Virginia's land cover data set work for you. So here there's a link. Yeah, thank you. That's okay. There's a link here to the Virginia GIS Clearinghouse, which is managed by VITA, and they have the technical plan there. There's also the use case white paper. It talks about everything that I've covered today within Virginia, and then there's also some additional use cases within the paper. And then the raster download, the vector download, and then there's also county tabular data there. So we've provided a report that breaks down each county and overall acreage for each of the 12 classifications. And you can download the data or you can open it as a web service. So I've got my email here, jennifer.ellsworth@worldviewsolutions.com. And then I know that Steve is going to be putting this presentation up on VITA's website or VITA's website. So I've also included the case study links for everything that I've talked about today. And that's it. So I know no one stopped me
before, Jennifer, but are there any questions that anybody has for Jennifer at this point?
Yes.
Oh, come on. Somebody's got to have a question or two out there.
Well, if they do have additional questions, they can always reach out to me or refer to any of these technical documents. And the Virginia land cover data set is out there, as well as the Chesapeake Bay watershed model that they're developing. That's at a 10 meter resolution, and that's for the specific model they're using. But, when they see that data come out, just know that the Virginia product is 1 meter and that you can use this data set individually.
And again, this is Steve Marzoff. I want to stress that the reason we put these sessions on is for all of you. And the Commonwealth made a significant investment in the development of this data. It was mandated upon both DEQ and VITA through the Appropriations Act for us to take on this project and to do it. But the source of that was then Senator John Watkins who really, in talking to him, he was the chair of the region board at the time, really wanted this data for the localities. Many of the localities have requirements to do runoff calculations for the Chesapeake Bay and so forth. So rather than having 50, 60 localities all having to do this, his idea was, let's produce it once, let's do it statewide so it's available to all. And some of these case studies that Jennifer went through, those types of projects were what he envisioned as being helpful to the localities in determining environmental impacts and development impacts and so forth. So this data is for you. It's out there. We hope that you use it. And today's session was really trying to spark the ideas and to get people to see the value of it and understand how they can use it. Whether it's the land cover, or it's the LIDAR, or even the imagery that's been around now over 10 years, we want to make sure that we're leveraging those investments to the maximum possible. So if you do have any questions, my staff in the ISB and VGen is available to you as well. Regional coordinators for the localities, if you want to reach out to them as an entry point into the with your question, please feel free to do that. We may not all be expert on all this. I have to be honest that some of this was Greek to me in listening to it, but we will find you the answers if we don't have that. So any last questions about either the data, the availability? One common question we get is about our plans to update it. We don't have funding to do that, but we are talking with and working with DEQ, talk about the potential future, how we might update this in the future, whether it be another appropriation or if there was some other means. But again, we want to make this available to you. Any last questions or comments? I do see somebody noted on the chat window that they're downloading the data now. So, and Corey, did you have a question on the chat? I see it says question. Are these downloads specifically for watershed?
So no, the data is actually divided based on how the VBMP imagery is flown. So they're in mostly kind of squared off tiles, and you can download just each piece and kind of piece them together. And that's also why we provided the county tabular data in case each locality just wanted to look at what was within their county. But the data altogether is very large. I think it's like 30 gigabytes or something. So, you should only have to download that is within your area.
Yeah, 30 gigabytes isn't all that much anymore. That's barely a
Yeah,
movie.
that's true. You're welcome.
All right. Well,
Okay.
if there aren't any other questions for today, thank you again, Jennifer, for the presentation, and Worldview more generally for their great work on this project. And
you're very welcome.
If anybody has any questions they think of later, feel free to reach out to any of us. And we'll be doing more webinar Wednesdays, so please check our website. The recording of this one will be available in a few days. And otherwise, have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks.